Hi everyone. I haven't really done a video in a while, but there is something new that came up recently that's so awesome that I just couldn't wait. It's something I've seen in a private preview and was so excited. I just really wanted to tell everyone about it, but I couldn't because of obvious reasons. So now that it's finally available as a public preview thing, I really want to show it to you. So cool, I'm sure you'll love it. And this new thing is workflows in Copilot Studio. You can find them and try them out if you've got an early preview sort of an environment, which would usually have a preview subdomain in here under copilotstudio.preview.microsoft.com, as you can see over here. Now, to get that, you might need an environment that's based in Canada or the US, which is something I've got. And then you might need to enable the experimental and preview AI models via the Power Platform Admin Center. So if you've got that on, you should by default actually land in something like this whenever you switch to an environment where that's enabled. And when you have that, and you go to flows, which is where you'd normally create agent flows, you now have the default button set to a new workflow, which is the new feature. We can still create agent flows, but I mean, why would we? Anyway, so in this particular demo environment, I've actually got one set up, and I really want to show it to you because it's so cool. This is basically what it looks like, and as you can see, the designer is completely revamped. And you know, whether or not you preferred the classic designer in Power Automate, or you're more of a modern designer fan, or whatever, I'm sure you will love this one because it really is slick. It's very nice, and it has so many cool features that I can't really even think of anything else I'd want in it, to be honest. And so let me quickly take you through this. Now, as you can see, it's quite different to what we're used to. First of all, it's horizontal. You kind of have to read it from left to right, which is unusual if you're used to Power Automate or agent flows. But it's, on the other hand, it's actually quite familiar to those of us who work with processes, because it looks a lot like a process flow chart, or those of us switching from other tools like make.com or Anytime or whatever, where it actually looks similar to this, and it's quite intuitive and easy to use. But in case you would, for whatever reason, prefer to have it in the sort of a top to bottom view, that's actually still available, and we've got a button down here that actually lets us switch to vertical, which, if you ask me, doesn't really look as good anymore in this view. I actually prefer the horizontal view. And as you can see, I can drag this around the way I want to. I can actually do this fit to view thing, which is basically zooms it up. I was actually hoping it would shorter some of those lines for me, but yeah, it doesn't really do that. But I can also zoom in and out by just normal zoom in views. I can drag each action around, switch them up the way I want to, do whatever I want to, and they stick around the way they don't lose any of their connectivity, and I can just do all of this nonsense, although I wouldn't want to. There is also a tidy up button over there that just cleans it up for us, makes it much cleaner. I have no idea why it orders some of them like this. Seems like it's sort of an alphabetical order in some cases, but it does that. I guess it might still need some polishing. It's still in preview after all, but it's still quite cool. I love this. And there's this cool way in which actions are connected right now. We still have, under each action, we still have the settings functionality where we can configure what it runs after, but we can't really change the action in here. We need to actually work through these. I can always delete a connection, and then you see all of the steps that suddenly become inactive because they will never be invoked, as there is no connection leading to them. but then I can always create a new one, and it's just as simple as that. I click on a dot in one action, drag it to the other one, and it works as easily as that. I've also tested out a few ways in which I can actually make, you know, multiple steps lead to the same one. This is actually possible as well. I've just, you know, what I just did is obviously nonsense, but that is still actually possible. I can create parallel branches basically in here. That just works perfectly fine as well. And what I really love about this is that there is a dedicated sort of a feature functionality action, you call it maybe, it's not really a step in the flow, for adding notes, which is quite cool. I honestly didn't really like the notes on actions in Power Automate because, first of all, they wouldn't really be visible from a sort of a bird's eye view from the top, and this really adds a way to sort of document things clearly and visibly. And it's, you know, if we ever wanted to use this for documentation, it would also be possible to include that as well by just basically, you know, printing this out if we wanted to. That's quite cool. Now, if we delve deeper into the other functionality, other than visually, it also has plenty of other cool features that I want to show you. Now, it generally works similarly to how agent flows or Power Automate Cloud flows work. We have a trigger that starts a flow. We can start it by a connector trigger, but there's also, you know, the usual ways to start it, by a manual trigger, a recurrence, basically a schedule, or an HTTP request, which is something I don't recommend using anyway. But basically, once we set that up, we then also have some really cool new actions and capabilities that weren't available in either Power Automate or even Agent Flow either. So we've got these cool agentic functionality that are already there, visible in this side pane over here. If we expand, if we collapse it, it doesn't get in the way. But if we ever want to, you know, add a step in a specific part of our flow, we can also just click this, and then we see a much wider menu for what we want to choose from. There's obviously the usual connector steps, but these are always at the top, and they're quite cool. Some of them are really impressive, and I want to take you through them. Now, the one I really like is the classify step. So what this basically means is that we give it some inputs, we choose a model, whatever, well, there's some options to choose from, and then we define some categories based on natural language explanations on what we expect to land in those categories. So for example, if I'm monitoring a supplier inbox where we normally receive supplier invoices, account statements, master data updates, and some other communication from suppliers, I would, you know, expect them to usually fall into these three categories for the vast majority of emails, and then the rest would just basically be some default category. And I would describe them with natural language explanations, such as, you know, emails with attachments that are supplier invoices sent to us for payment, and so on, and things like that. And then this essentially creates a sort of a branching out functionality for whatever further steps should take place if it falls into a certain category. So if, for example, it's an invoice, I'll get the attachment, I'll do some further steps, usually some approval functionality, and then potentially process the invoice, maybe create it in an ERP system or whatever. If there is an account statement, I might do something else, whereas I need to pull data from my ERP and check the values in there and maybe respond to that email. If it's a master data update, I might need to update that data in my ERP system and so on. So that's pretty cool. So I actually looked this up in Power Automate, because when we save a workflow, it actually becomes available in Power Automate, which looks ugly. It really doesn't work that well. But this step in the background actually has two normal Power Automate actions, which would basically be a classification step using the Dataverse connector, and then a switch. So essentially a switch functionality to sort of a conditionally spread this across multiple branches, which makes sense. But in this case, it's obviously much cleaner, and we can, easily describe the whole thing. Now, the next sort of an agentic AI functionality that I really love about this is the guardrails. Now, the guardrails obviously is something you would normally want in any AI functionality, but especially AI functionality that is externally facing. And in this case, what we're basically tracking is emails. So yeah, they're external information coming in. So we might want to have some guardrails in place. And what I've got in this case is basically I'm checking the body of the email for any prompt injection attempts, right? So, and it's just like that. I enable this, and that's fine. There is also, potentially possible to check for any personally identifiable information, but it doesn't really matter in this case. But you might want that if you're operating in a regulated environment, or if you just don't want to push any personally identifiable information through any of the other models that you're using, store that data anywhere or whatever. And then there's also content moderation available as well for various topics if needed. So I find this really cool and helpful, an easy way to just basically avoid any potential issues with your flow before anything else runs. That's why I've got it in the very beginning. If the guardrail fails, I'll stop the flow. If it passes, then I'll continue. And if I do continue, there are also a few really cool things. What I've got in here are human review steps. I've got a couple of them in here. So these are basically a better way to do approvals in here, essentially. I've tried using standard approvals in this menu, and it doesn't really quite work as well. I mean, it technically is possible to add it, but then as soon as I try adding some attachments or whatever, it starts failing because it doesn't really, it's not really supported that well. So, but human review is essentially almost the same thing with more flexibility and basically works much better. So what I can do in here is essentially, yeah, I just provide some titles, some message, assign someone to send this request to, and choose a channel to send it through. So I can choose Outlook or Teams, and they will, the human in the loop, or the human who's supposed to review the request, will essentially just receive either an Outlook message or a Teams message with the whole thing, and with some input fields that I define, custom input fields. So in this case, I'm actually checking an invoice, so essentially asking if the particular invoice we received via email should be approved for booking and payment or not. And obviously that's an important step, because if it is an invoice, if it gets booked without human review, it might be a fake invoice, a scam invoice, or some incorrect information in it. And we want to be sure that whatever we book is actually correct and should be there. And then we can add whatever fields we want, and if it gets approved, I'll process it, I'll book it. If it doesn't get approved, I'll forward that to someone else, and include the comments, which is a dynamic content produced by here because of the custom field, and I'll essentially forward it to someone for review and why it was rejected. It's quite cool. You can do the same in here for a master data update. Again, important to make sure that when we're updating a supplier information, especially the payment details, that's an actually legitimate request and not a phishing attempt, basically. So this has to be reviewed by a human before anything happens automatically. Right, and then there is another cool AI-based functionality that's called extract. So this works similarly to AI builder models, for example. And I've just essentially have an a dedicated action that can extract information from documents, and I'll just basically get the content bytes of the attachment and describe some of the fields that I want to parse out of it. So for example, in an invoice, I would expect some supplier name, supplier ID, an invoice number, the total amount, and obviously some other fields in an actual real life scenario would probably make sense, but this is enough for me. And with that, in case I can then, once I've extracted those things, I can actually use that data in further steps. Now, what's not as great about this is the fact that whenever I do use that, what I get is essentially, if I wanted to use the dynamic contents of it, I get things like this, like extracted data. That's an object, which is quite weird because I would have expected that when I define the fields in here, I can, I'll have them as a structured sort of a dynamic content output that I could use, but I cannot. However, I can still obviously write expressions to fetch that information, and I can view what I've got in here. So I've basically, so it's structured output, but yeah, I'm fetching this field. So expressions is obviously a thing we can still use in here, so and we might end up using some of them. Because of the limitations. I expect this to actually be polished in the future, and it would hopefully return proper dynamic contents for each field later on when it's available generally to everyone. And then what's probably the most important feature in here when it comes to these agentic AI features is the agents, the possibility to call agents, and what's more important than just the fact that we can actually call agents is that there are a few different options to choose from. So I can not only can I actually call Copilot Studio agents, but if I had any M365 agents, I would actually be able to call them via this step. M365 Copilot, I have a step like that. I don't want any in here because this is a particular flow that doesn't really use any, but I could do that. But if I use Copilot Studio agents, I have the option to choose from existing agents in this environment, but I can also just create a new agent in here from basically inline and play around with it, which is pretty impressive if you ask me. And then there's obviously prompts too, so if I wanted to add that, I could add a prompt, and again just basically describe in natural language what I want to do, provide inputs, whatever I want, and then even describe whatever outputs I want. And this one, if I add any properties with structured output, they actually work pretty well in terms of then being available for further steps. Right, and then there are a few more cool things in terms of the new designer as a whole, which I think you would also really love to see. And one of those things is that I can do much more than just drag and drop this. If I hold shift while I do it, I can also select multiple steps, right? That's pretty cool. Not that I can do much with it. I could, and then the shift is a bit more of a pain. I'm not really holding it anymore, but it's still doing this sometimes, right? So you might need to get adapted to it, but it does this. And then if I there we go. So I can actually move them around. I could also just delete all of them. Well, I don't really want that, but that's also a way to clean this up very quickly. And then if I did accidentally delete stuff, there is a cool thing called version control over here. And the coolest thing about version control is not only that I can actually restore a version, which is something we're all already very much used to, but I can also actually compare a version. So comparing a version that the current one with whatever I've chosen from the version history means that I see all of the changes that have been made. So I've made some modifications. Now these aren't really great, right? So this doesn't say much. I can click on a specific action. It takes me to the action that has been modified, but it's not really clear on what exactly was modified. I'm hoping that this gets improved over time, but in general, the fact that we can actually compare it is already a major step. We can't really do that in Power Automate Cloud Flows yet. Right, so that's pretty cool. And on top of that, there is also something really cool, is that if when we're building a flow and we want to test it out, we no longer actually need to test the full flow. We don't even need to save it to test an individual step. We can do that by selecting a step and selecting the test menu in here, where we can either choose a previous run and use the inputs from it for the test, or we can just pass in some sample inputs and see what it does. So for example, this is a classify step, right? So I can just, if I take a body of an email I've already got ready, right? So that's just a string. That's yeah, I'm writing to you on behalf of some company, and yeah, we would like to reconcile our account balance. Okay, let's see what it thinks this is. Yeah, so it predicts it should be an account statement, which makes a lot of sense because that's an actual account statement. Okay, if I try to do something else, let's see, I've got something like this. Information about issuing the invoice number is something, right? Let's try this out. Okay, supplier invoice seems to be doing quite well, which is really nice. So this is a major step forward because we can now test individual steps without needing to run the full flow, which makes it easier to test. Also makes it easier to save some credits as well. But we don't even need to save or publish it to be able to test it, which is also very important because we don't want to publish something that hasn't been properly tested, and sometimes we might not even be able to publish a full flow because there are some configurational issues in some of the steps, whereas we're just trying to figure out what a certain step would produce. So I can in fact just basically test out an individual step to see the outputs it produces, and then use those outputs in, if I need to write an expression, for example. Also, if I do need to write an expression, like in this case, for example, when I'm getting an attachment, I obviously don't want, I just, for example, for the demo purposes, want to get one attachment, right? The one that should be an invoice. Normally there could be multiple attachments to an email. So if I just use the dynamic contents for the attachment ID, that would actually end up creating a loop, as it indicates over here, because that's an array, right? So instead I needed an expression to fetch only one attachment, and what I did was I used Copilot over here saying, can you get me the ID of the first attachment from the when a new email arrives trigger action, and see what it says. And I mean, this doesn't always necessarily create it correctly, but when you describe it properly, it usually works quite well. This is what it suggests. I'm not inserting it because I've already got it, but that's the same expression because I've actually generated it with Copilot previously as well. And it works quite well. And then on top of all of this, there is also some quite nice additions to what we're actually already familiar with in Power Automate or agent flows, is that, for example, if we have a condition, normally in Power Automate, that's just an if-else, and if we want more branches, we'd use a switch, if that's possible. In this case, in workflows in Copilot Studio, we can actually add more branches. So that's more like an if, else, if, and basically whatever we want. So we could actually have multiple different branches for different conditions in there, which would essentially effectively be evaluated in sequence. So if this is true, then that's what gets executed, but if it's not true, then the next one gets executed, and so on. And only if all of them are false, the else kicks in, which is, if you're familiar with programming, that's a normal practice, although obviously it could potentially lead to very complex and large constructs that don't make much sense, so don't overcomplicate your flows, but it obviously is much better than a bunch of nested else or if-else statements that we used to have in Power Automate. And on top of that, my personal, well, almost favorite, I can't really say favorite because there's all that many things that I've already mentioned that are probably even more of a favorite for me. But there is also a very cool thing when it comes to using variables, which I don't really use in this flow. I generally don't like using variables in Power Automate, for example, and the main reason why is because they clutter the flow. Whenever we need to initialize a variable, we need to, create a new step and a new step for updating that variable, and they can't be hidden inside scopes, so, they make my flows look ugly, so I try to avoid them usually. But I'm thinking that I will probably be using them much more in Copilot Studio workflows, because when I use a variable in here, I can not only initialize a variable here, let's say that would be something like a string, right? But I can actually initialize multiple variables in a single step. So pretty much as many as I want, so they can all be in a single step somewhere in the beginning of the flow, and it will look much nicer and it will not clutter our flows. And I can also do the same with updating, so I can update multiple variables in a single step, which, it doesn't probably make much sense, but still makes our flows look cleaner, and it makes it possible to actually use variables. So this is something that has actually been available in Logic Apps, and I was hoping it would find its way to Power Automate, but it didn't. It seems to have skipped Power Automate but gotten into workflows in Copilot Studio, which is, well, at least it's here. So that's also quite nice. And again, you've probably noticed me doing this a couple of times. It really is nice in how it actually captures the connections automatically. In most cases, whenever I delete a step or add something, it just really does it quite cleanly. It might move those steps around a little bit, but that's usually not as bad because, again, we have the tidy up button that helps us clean things up quite a bit. And then there was one more thing I wanted to show you, and, well, maybe even more than one, but essentially one thing that applies to multiple features is that we can actually, when viewing a few different screens, which are things like code view or even just the parameters of the action, but it's very useful in code view, is that I can in fact expand it to full screen. and then view a bunch of different parameters over here. So when I'm using this, I can see which steps are available, which parameters are available for me as inputs. I can run the tests over here in a single screen basically, and I can also expand the code view as well like this, so I can see this in a prettier way. And the same applies to some other screens, such as, for example, the activity screen, which essentially shows a few of my flow runs from previously, where I have a few failures, a few cancellations, a few successful runs. And if I look into one of those, I can actually trace the whole way it went, right? So in this case, I just basically ignored the request to review the whole thing, but I can trace back the path it took. I can see all of the inputs, and it's all visible in the same screen. I haven't left the designer essentially, and I'm seeing the inputs. I could see the run details for the specific message that's been processed. I can see the classification outputs, for example, and why it was essentially classified as master data update and so on. And I just, I basically just switch back between that, switch back to build, and I'm back in here where I can do all of this. So that's what this new designer is all about, is essentially it makes the whole experience much slicker, much more intuitive, much easier to work with, essentially, because we don't need to navigate between multiple screens. We don't need to publish the flow just to test it, or move out of the designer just to see previous test runs and so on. So much in a single place, and it still works very nice, very smoothly, and it's just basically beautiful. So I'm really happy for this. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you'll try this out and share whatever experiences you've had with it. And thank you for watching this video. Thank you for sticking around this long, and good luck with playing around with Copilot Studio workflows.